Welcome to the Serial Killer Files. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving deep into the shadows of one of America's most notorious serial killers. You think you know the story of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, the bodies buried beneath his house, the final arrest that shocked the nation. But what you're about to hear are the untold stories, the accounts of those who encountered the monster and lived to tell about it, the victims whose names you may never have heard, and the chilling evolution of a predator who hid in plain sight for over a decade. This is not just another retelling of Gacy's crimes. This is the story of survival, of narrow escapes, and of the young men who faced evil and somehow found the strength to fight back. Some made it home. Others weren't so fortunate. All of their stories deserve to be told. Enter the disturbing world of history's most notorious serial killers. Examine their twisted motives, uncover shocking details that challenge long-held beliefs, and explore the dark psychology that turns ordinary people into monsters. From crime scenes to confessions, Serial Killer Files takes you deeper than ever before. If you're hooked on true crime, forensic science, and psychological thrillers, you need to check out Serial Killer Files, an AI-powered podcast app from Skoob. With over 1,500 binge-worthy episodes, it delivers chilling facts, gripping storytelling, and insights into both famous and lesser-known killers. Every episode is short, intense, and impossible to pause. Download Skoob today from the App Store or Google Play and discover the terrifying minds behind the world's most infamous serial murders. Coming back to John Wayne Gacy, our story begins in the summer of 1967 in Waterloo, Iowa. The Beatles had just released Sgt. Pepper's. The summer of love was in full swing, and a 16-year-old boy named Edward Lynch was simply trying to earn some money washing dishes at a KFC franchise. He had no idea that his boss, John Wayne Gacy, was already experimenting with the methods that would make him one of history's most prolific serial killers. Gacy had a preference for hiring teenage boys. He claimed it was purely economic. They worked harder for less money. But there was something else, something that would only become clear in hindsight. He often paid these young workers 2 to 3 times more than they could earn elsewhere. It seemed generous. It was actually grooming. Taking inspiration from Dean Corll, another serial killer whose basement would become a chamber of horrors, Gacy established what he called a social club in the basement of his home. Picture this, a typical suburban basement but stocked with alcohol, drugs, pornography, and a pool table. To unsuspecting parents, Gacy appeared to be a successful, trustworthy manager. They had no problem letting their teenage sons visit his home. The basement gatherings always followed the same pattern: pool games with escalating stakes. Eventually, Gacy would propose oral sex as the prize for victory. When boys reacted with disgust or confusion, he'd play it off as a joke, testing their boundaries, learning what he could get away with. Edward Lynch knew nothing about this exclusive boys' club when Gacy invited him over. The timing was deliberate. Gacy's wife, Marlene, had just given birth to their second child and was recovering in the hospital. Instead of being with his family during this crucial time, Gacy saw an opportunity to satisfy his darkest urges. Lynch arrived to find music playing, drinks flowing, and an invitation to play pool. The stakes, Gacy said, would be revealed after the game. Whether Gacy lost on purpose or Lynch genuinely won doesn't matter. What happened next revealed the monster that Gacy was becoming. When Lynch refused Gacy's advances, rage consumed his host. Gacy forced Lynch upstairs, grabbing a carving knife from the kitchen as they passed through. In the bedroom, a violent struggle ensued. Lynch's arm was accidentally cut during the fight, and for a moment Gacy seemed to snap back to reality. He bandaged the wound, expressing what seemed like genuine remorse. But it was all part of the game. Despite Lynch wanting to leave, Gacy insisted they return to the basement for what he called a relaxing pornography viewing. Intimidated and bleeding, Lynch complied. That's when Gacy introduced what would become his signature weapon of terror, the handcuff trick. "Let me show you something," Gacy said, producing a pair of handcuffs. "It's a game. I'll cuff your hands behind your back, and you try to escape." Lynch, still shaken from the earlier violence, allowed himself to be restrained. He couldn't free himself. That's when Gacy climbed onto his lap, his hands moving across Lynch's thighs as the teenager sat helplessly bound. But Gacy wasn't finished. He chained Lynch's feet, then began to suffocate him. Lynch, in a desperate bid for survival, urinated himself and feigned death, a strategy that may have saved his life. Gacy, perhaps reminded of his own fainting spells and blackouts, panicked. He tapped Lynch's face repeatedly, asking if he was all right. When Lynch regained consciousness, Gacy offered an awkward apology and drove him home, with strict instructions to never speak of what had happened. A few days later, Lynch's employment at the restaurant was terminated. Gacy was already perfecting the art of silencing his victims. Edward Lynch survived, but his story gives us a chilling glimpse into the mind of a killer in development. This wasn't yet the methodical predator who would terrorize Chicago for over a decade. This was Gacy learning his craft, discovering what gave him power, and testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. Fast forward 8 years to July 31st, 1975. By now, Gacy had perfected his public persona. He was a successful contractor, politically connected, involved in Democratic politics, and even performed as Pogo the Clown for children's charities. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, the monster had been growing stronger. John Butkovich was 18 years old, just trying to make some money working construction for PDM Contractors, Gacy's company. He had dreams of traveling to Puerto Rico, but first, he needed to collect his paycheck. What should have been a simple transaction became the spark that would end his life. The confrontation happened on July 30th. Butkovich, accompanied by 2 friends, approached Gacy about his overdue wages. He was frustrated, angry, and ready to quit. But Gacy had other plans. He claimed Butkovich owed money for carpeting that had been installed in his apartment, carpeting charged to the company account. The debt, Gacy insisted, meant Butkovich had to keep working until the next payday. The meeting ended with Butkovich seething over his unpaid wages, but it wasn't over. The next evening, July 31st, Gacy was driving through Chicago when he spotted Butkovich on the corner of West Lawrence Avenue. The young man appeared to have been in a fight, bruised, bloodied, and vulnerable. Gacy, playing the concerned employer, offered to take him home to tend to his injuries. Back at Gacy's house, their argument reignited, this time fueled by alcohol as Gacy cleaned Butkovich's wounds. The situation escalated quickly. Butkovich, his anger boiling over, began striking Gacy. It was exactly the kind of resistance that triggered Gacy's most violent impulses. To defuse the situation, or so it seemed, Gacy offered to show Butkovich his handcuff trick. By now, this wasn't just a party trick, it was a weapon. When Butkovich couldn't free himself, his anger turned to panic, then to threats. He threatened to kill Gacy. That was all the justification Gacy needed. Moving with practiced efficiency, Gacy retrieved a rope, pinned Butkovich to the floor, sat on his chest, and executed what he called his rope trick. This wasn't the clumsy experimental violence of the Edward Lynch encounter. This was murder, methodical and deliberate. Gacy watched dispassionately as Butkovich struggled, convulsed, and died. Then he moved the body to his garage. He had intended to bury it in his crawl space, a location that would become synonymous with his crimes. But his wife and stepdaughters returned home unexpectedly. Quick thinking was required. Gacy hastily buried Butkovich in a hole he had previously excavated for a drain tile in the garage, then covered it with concrete. For years, the young man's family would search for answers, contacting police over 100 times. Marko and Terezia Butkovic, immigrants from Yugoslavia, never stopped believing their son deserved justice. It wasn't until December 29, 1978, over 3 years later, that John Butkovic's remains were finally identified through dental records. When police brought Gacy back to his house after his arrest, he calmly marked the burial location with orange spray paint, drawing a stick figure to show the position and orientation of the body. John Butkovic's murder marked a turning point. This wasn't a crime of passion or a situation that spiraled out of control. Oh, this was premeditated murder, carried out by a man who had learned to use trust and authority as weapons, the concerned employer helping an injured worker, the handcuff trick presented as harmless fun, the rope positioned as a game until it became an instrument of death. With Butkovic's murder, John Wayne Gacy had crossed a line from which there was no return. By 1976, Gacy had become a master manipulator. His methods were refined, his confidence unshakable, and his ability to read and exploit vulnerability had reached a terrifying level of sophistication. This is the year we meet David Cram, an 18-year-old whose encounter with Gacy would reveal just how calculated these attacks had become. It was July 26, 1976, and David Cram was hitchhiking along Elston Avenue when a silver Oldsmobile station wagon pulled over. The PDM contractor's sign in the window suggested legitimate business, and the stocky driver who introduced himself as John Gacy seemed professional, even friendly. Cram worked at a tire repair shop, but was interested in construction work. Gacy, sensing opportunity, immediately began his pitch. He could offer $3.66 an hour, significantly more than Cram was currently earning. There would be deductions, 66 cents specifically, but the pay was still attractive. Gacy told Cram to call him that evening if he was interested. This wasn't random kindness. This was recruitment. That evening, following Gacy's instructions, Cram called and was soon picked up by one of Gacy's employees. At Gacy's house, he met several other teenage workers, all part of what Gacy was building, a workforce of vulnerable young men under his control. Their first assignment was painting a hot dog stand called Oppie's. While the other boys took the truck, Cram found himself alone with Gacy in the Oldsmobile. This, too, was calculated. During the ride, Gacy began his psychological profiling, talking about himself with grandiose claims and carefully observing Cram's reactions. Gacy claimed to have degrees in sociology and psychology, tools, he said, that helped him manipulate people more effectively. He spoke about planting ideas that would grow over time, about subtle influence and control. To an 18-year-old, these might have sounded like the boasts of a successful businessman. In reality, they were the methods of a predator explaining his craft. The conversation then took a more sinister turn. Gacy broached his bisexuality, suggesting that advancement at PDM contractors might depend on an employee's moral flexibility. The message was clear. Sexual compliance could lead to better opportunities and more money than the base pay of $3 an hour. Gacy painted a picture of wealth and success, $500,000 annually with projections of reaching $1 million. He boasted about his well-stocked bar and frequent parties attended by politicians, lawyers, and judges. For a young man working at a tire shop, this world must have seemed both enticing and intimidating. Over the following weeks, Cram continued working for Gacy, slowly learning more about his employer's darker side. While cleaning the garage, he discovered wallets containing various forms of identification. One driver's license matched his own physical description so closely that he asked Gacy if he could have it, hoping to use it to buy liquor since he was underage. Gacy's response was chilling. He chuckled and explained that the identification belonged to someone who was dead, someone connected to syndicate business. Gacy then revealed more about his alleged criminal connections, claiming he set targets for hits but didn't execute them himself. When Cram was late for work, Gacy gave him a watch that he said had belonged to one of his victims. Whether these syndicate claims were true or elaborate fantasies designed to intimidate, they served their purpose. Gacy was establishing himself as someone dangerous, someone not to be crossed. On August 21, 1976, Gacy offered Cram a room in his house for just $25 a week. With his recent divorce, he said, Cram would practically have the house to himself. It seemed like a great deal. Cram moved in, and his 19th birthday followed the next day. That birthday celebration would become one of the most terrifying nights of Cram's life. After spending the day drinking and possibly smoking marijuana with friends, Cram returned home well after midnight, heavily intoxicated. What he found waiting for him would haunt him forever. John Wayne Gacy stood in the living room, wearing a full clown costume. This was Pogo the Clown, Gacy's alter ego for children's charity events. But there was nothing charitable about what was about to happen. Gacy, still in costume, explained that he had a children's event the next day and thought it would be amusing to stay dressed as Pogo for Cram's birthday. They moved to the sunken living room that served as a bar area, centered around Gacy's large lounge chair facing the television. What followed was a carefully orchestrated seduction and assault. Gacy offered hefty shots of 190 proof grain alcohol while performing in his clown persona. He had taken a tranquilizer, possibly Valium, which he used increasingly frequently, and the combination of drugs, alcohol, and the grotesque clown makeup created an atmosphere of surreal menace. Then came the handcuff trick. Gacy demonstrated first, showing how he could escape from the cuffs with practiced ease. When he offered to let Cram try, the intoxicated teenager didn't think much of it. But when the cuffs clicked shut around Cram's wrists, he quickly realized this wasn't a trick at all. It was a trap. Trapped and unable to free himself, Cram asked to be released. Instead, Pogo seized the chain between the cuffs and began swinging Cram around violently, the painted clown face leering as he announced his intention to rape the helpless young man. But David Cram had something many of Gacy's victims didn't: military training. He had spent a year in the Army and knew basic combat techniques. When Gacy's grip loosened, causing Cram to stagger into a TV stand, the young man found himself with just enough room to maneuver. As Pogo lumbered toward him, confident in his apparent dominance, Cram struck. A single, well-placed kick to Gacy's head sent the clown crashing to the floor, the grease paint smearing across his painted face. For several seconds, Gacy lay motionless, while Cram frantically searched for and found the keys to free himself. By the time Gacy regained his feet, Cram was no longer his helpless victim. The two men faced each other in tense silence, the smudged clown and the freed prisoner. Gacy, despite the mark of violence on his painted face, looked like one of the sorrowful clowns depicted in the paintings that adorned his front room. Cram retreated to his room and secured the door. But the damage was done. He had seen behind the mask, literally and figuratively. The successful contractor, the children's entertainer, the community leader. It was all a facade hiding something monstrous. David Cram's story is remarkable not just because he survived, but because he fought back successfully. His military training and quick thinking turned him from victim to victor in a matter of seconds. But his experience also reveals how refined Gacy's methods had become by 1976. The alcohol, the drugs, the performance, the gradual escalation, everything was calculated to render his victims helpless. Most terrifying of all was the ease with which Gacy shifted between personas. One moment he was the friendly employer offering opportunity. The next he was Pogo, the clown attempting rape. The psychological mask was as much a part of his arsenal as the physical restraints. Just months after David Cram's narrow escape, John Wayne Gacy claimed another victim. This time, there would be no survival story, no last-minute rescue, no military training to provide salvation. Gregory Godzik was 17 years old with long blonde hair, a slender build, and gray eyes that would never again see the Christmas he was looking forward to. December 11th, 1976, started as a night full of promise for Gregory. He was excited about his date with his girlfriend Judy. Their relationship had been rocky. They'd broken up and reconciled, which made this evening feel particularly important. As he prepared to leave home, his family playfully teased him for skipping Mass to go on his date. Gregory laughed along, kissed his mother on the cheek, a ritual he never missed, and walked out into the night. Gregory was the kind of young man any parent would be proud of. Since 7th grade, he'd worked various jobs, mowing lawns, delivering newspapers, always eager to earn his own money. He was a senior at Taft High School, with college plans for the following year. His love for nature was evident in how he cared for injured birds and abandoned cats, nursing them back to health with infinite patience. For Christmas, Gregory had asked for new clothes and a special hairbrush, simple gifts that he would never receive. When his mother discovered his empty room the next morning, worry set in immediately. She called Judy, contacted his friends, reached out to anyone who might have seen him. A missing persons report was filed, but the police response was dismissive. Just another runaway teenager, they suggested. They'd have to wait before launching any real search. Days passed. Then a friend discovered Gregory's car abandoned and unlocked in Niles. This detail alarmed his mother more than anything else. Gregory would never leave his car unsecured. She knew something was gravely wrong. That's when she remembered Gregory's new job. For the past 3 weeks, he'd been working for a contractor named John Wayne Gacy. He'd come home late recently, mentioning that he was digging trenches for various projects. It seemed like honest work for decent pay. When Gregory's mother contacted Gacy, his response was perfectly crafted to deflect suspicion. Gregory hadn't shown up for work on Monday, he said, despite calling in to say he would be there. Gacy brushed off her concerns with practiced ease. Gregory had probably just run away, like countless other teenagers. He even mentioned owing Gregory money and promised to deliver it to her personally. That promise, like so many of Gacy's assurances, would never be kept. Despite the discouragement from authorities, Gregory's mother refused to give up. She hired a private investigator, despite the financial strain, and spent her own time scouring Chicago, searching for any trace of her son. For 2 years, she lived in agony, not knowing whether Gregory was dead or alive, safe or suffering. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more horrifying than she could have imagined. When John Wayne Gacy was arrested in December 1978 and the bodies began to be exhumed from beneath his house, Gregory Godzik was among them. His remains were labeled as Body 4, identified through dental records on December 29, 1978. The tragic irony was inescapable. Gregory had been buried in a spot he had unwittingly helped prepare while working for Gacy, underneath the remains of another victim, John Sick. Gregory had been digging his own grave and didn't even know it. The loss of Gregory Godzik represents something particularly heartbreaking about Gacy's crimes. This wasn't a vulnerable runaway or a young man engaged in risky behavior. This was a responsible teenager with a loving family, college plans, and a bright future. He was targeted simply because he needed a job and happened to encounter a monster who saw opportunity in his youth and innocence. Gregory's story also illustrates how Gacy had perfected the art of misdirection. When questioned by worried family members, he presented himself as the concerned employer, just as puzzled and worried as they were. His offer to deliver Gregory's final paycheck was a masterful touch, a gesture that suggested both his legitimacy and his concern for the missing young man. But perhaps most chilling is the realization that Gregory spent his final weeks unknowingly preparing his own burial site. Every trench he dug, every foundation he helped excavate, was potentially a grave for himself or another victim. Gacy had created a system where his victims literally participated in their own destruction. Gregory John Godzik was laid to rest at St. Adalbert Catholic Cemetery in Niles Cook County, Illinois. His parents, who died in 1984 and 1989 respectively, were buried beside him. Born March 23, 1959, murdered December 12, 1976, Gregory's life was cut short at just 17 years old. His spirit lives on in the memory of those who loved him and in the legacy of a young man who deserved so much more than the evil that found him. If you're obsessed with true crime and fascinated by the minds of serial killers, Serial Killer Files by Skoob is your next must-listen. Dive into spine-chilling stories, psychological deep dives, and the darkest crimes in history, all delivered in fast-paced, binge-worthy episodes. Hit follow and subscribe to Serial Killer Files on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube so you never miss a terrifying new episode. Now let's get back to what Gacy's survivors had to say. While Gregory Godzik and John Butkovich became victims, others encountered Gacy and lived to tell their stories. These survival accounts provide a chilling window into Gacy's hunting patterns and the terrifying experiences of those who escaped his web. The streets of Chicago in the 1970s had their own communication network. Among the young men who worked as prostitutes, who hustled for survival, who lived on society's margins, stories traveled fast. And by the mid-1970s, there were whispers about a dangerous man who cruised in a black Oldsmobile equipped with spotlights, hunting for victims. Jamie was one of those streetwise young men. Often noted for his resemblance to Mick Jagger, he was a frequent presence at known gay meeting spots throughout the city. His first encounter with Gacy was almost mundane, a meeting arranged through another prostitute known as Speed Freak Billy at Bughouse Square, about half a mile north of Chicago's Loop. Bughouse Square had earned its distinctive name decades earlier when it served as a haven for impromptu political speeches. At all hours, self-appointed pundits would mount soapboxes to discourse on everything from Marxist ideology to UFO phenomena. But by the 1960s, the park's character had transformed completely. The enthusiastic speakers were replaced by vagrants and young wanderers, runaways, school skippers, and children whose parents showed little concern for their whereabouts. The park had earned a grim reputation as a chicken park, where young boys lingered near curbs, adjusting their clothing provocatively as cars slowed down. They called it throwing the basket out, and they commanded those sidewalks year-round, braving harsh Chicago weather until they could gather enough money for food, drugs, and another night at a cheap motel. Jamie's first visit to Gacy's house on Summerdale Avenue was relatively uneventful, despite an overwhelming sense of unease. The house felt preternaturally quiet, fraught with what Jamie described as bad vibrations like spirits. This sixth sense, common among those who live dangerously, left him anxious about being alone with his host. Gacy paid him $30 and gave him a handful of pills, reassuring him with practiced calm. "See, I'm okay. You can trust me. You'll be seeing me again." Then he drove Jamie back to Bughouse Square. It was several weeks later, under a bright gibbous moon, when Gacy approached Jamie again. This time, the encounter followed a different script. Instead of conversation and drinks, Jamie was led directly to a bedroom where both men stripped down. Gacy insisted that Jamie perform the services he was paid for. But before the young man could complete his task, Gacy's hand struck him violently across the face. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Jamie found himself struck again, his cries stifled by Gacy's grip around his throat. Having worked in the sex trade since the age of 12, Jamie recognized what he was dealing with. One of those clients who derived sexual satisfaction from inflicting pain. His survival depended on defending himself without provoking Gacy into even greater brutality. When Gacy produced handcuffs, Jamie knew he was fighting for his life. In a desperate bid for survival, he smashed a nearby vase over Gacy's head, threw the handcuffs away, and bit down hard on Gacy's wrist until he tasted blood. Then he played his trump card, claiming that a friend had written down the Oldsmobile's license plate number, a standard protection method among the boys. The lie worked, at least temporarily. But Gacy wasn't finished. He hefted Jamie onto the bed, throwing his considerable weight over the young man and pinning him to the mattress. Jamie found himself immobilized, gasping for air, as Gacy groaned above him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Gacy rolled off, rose, and turned on the lights, winded but disturbingly smiling. Time to get dressed and go home. Before leaving, Gacy paid Jamie $50, $30 for the agreed transaction and a $20 bonus, along with another batch of pills. The ride back to Bughouse Square was conducted in silence, both men understanding that something had fundamentally changed. Shaken by the terrifying ordeal, Jamie avoided the street scene for an entire month. When he finally returned, Speed Freak Billy casually mentioned his own clientele's interests: sadists, masochists, and bondage enthusiasts. Having experienced more than enough at the hands of sadists, Jamie was resolved to warn his friends about the man from Norwood Park. Another survivor came forward from an unexpected source. During the investigation into James Mazur's background, Detective Greg Beto discovered that a man using the pseudonym Arthur Wenzel, living in Los Angeles, had endured a terrifying experience with Gacy. Beto and a researcher traveled to California to obtain his first-hand account. Finding Wenzel required some detective work of their own. Initially, they tried locating him at a gay bar in Hollywood, where he reportedly worked, only to learn he had recently left his position. They found him the next day at his apartment and took him to a restaurant where, over coffee and lunch, Wenzel recounted his harrowing story. Wenzel's background made him a perfect target for Gacy's predatory instincts. His upbringing had been difficult, marked by movement through various foster homes and a juvenile record. As an adult, he described himself as a homosexual street hustler and an alcoholic, consuming about a fifth of liquor daily. Seeking better weather and opportunities, he had relocated from Chicago to Southern California. In January 1979, a shocking revelation came through a homosexual friend who sent him newspaper clippings about Gacy's arrest. Among the identified victims was John Syke, a former acquaintance with whom Wenzel had shared an intimate relationship. Despite having forgotten Gacy's name over time, Wenzel instantly recognized the contractor's photograph. His encounter with Gacy had occurred one morning during the fall of 1977. Wenzel had just exited a gay bar on Chicago's North Side when a black car equipped with 2 spotlights approached him. The driver, John Gacy, beckoned Wenzel by lowering the window and asking if he wanted to get high. At Gacy's house, Wenzel was led to a bar area where his host retrieved marijuana from the refrigerator and rolled several joints. After Wenzel had indulged in a few puffs, Gacy proposed consuming Valium and yellow downers from the bar cabinet. Notably, Gacy refrained from taking any pills himself, maintaining control while his victim became increasingly impaired. As Wenzel sat on the couch, Gacy expressed his preferences for S&M, gauging his guest's familiarity with the term. When Wenzel feigned ignorance, Gacy left the room only to return with a gold badge emblazoned detective, claiming he worked in the narcotics division downtown. Under this assumed authority, Gacy questioned Wenzel about his experience with handcuffs during sex. The psychological manipulation was masterful, combining drugs, authority, and sexual coercion to render his victim compliant. Gacy suggested moving to a bedroom, turning on the bathroom light while instructing Wenzel to undress. Under the misapprehension that Gacy was an eccentric police officer, Wenzel felt compelled to comply, despite the obvious power imbalance. Insisting that handcuffs and shackles were essential for his sexual gratification, Gacy bound Wenzel's hands behind his back and shackled his ankles. Lying on the bed with Gacy straddling him, the situation became increasingly ominous when Gacy produced a piece of rope and a wooden stick from a nearby closet. Gacy's threat was explicit. Disobedience would result in death. In a moment of quick thinking, Wenzel requested a bathroom break. Once inside, he managed to maneuver his cuffed hands from behind his back to his front, a crucial tactical advantage. When Gacy entered the bathroom, Wenzel expressed a desire to end the session, but Gacy's calm reassurances temporarily eased his concerns. Allowing himself to be recuffed voluntarily, Wenzel returned to the bedroom where Gacy demonstrated his rope technique. He placed the rope loosely around Wenzel's neck, securing it with 2 knots, then asked Wenzel to practice the technique using a shoelace and wooden stick. This rope trick matched descriptions Gacy would later provide after his arrest. As Gacy intensified the pressure on the rope, it became clear that this was no longer role play. This was attempted murder. As his breath failed, desperation fueled Wenzel's survival instinct. With an assertive twist of his body, he reached out and forcefully gripped Gacy's testicles and inner thigh, causing unbearable pain. The attack worked. Gacy's grip on the rope loosened, and Wenzel demanded its immediate removal. As they dressed afterward, Gacy even complained about the pain Wenzel had inflicted. Before parting ways, Gacy retrieved a small-caliber pistol, telling Wenzel that if he had truly intended to kill him, he would have used the gun instead. Like other survivors, Wenzel was dropped off at a transient hotel, where he showed evidence of his ordeal, rope burns on his neck and restraint marks on his wrists and ankles, to friends and a local bartender. Both Jamie and Arthur Wenzel's stories reveal crucial elements of Gacy's methodology: the careful drugging of victims, the use of authority and intimidation, the escalating violence, and the signature rope and stick technique that would become his preferred method of murder. Their survival came down to quick thinking, physical resistance, and sheer luck. More importantly, their stories show that word was spreading through Chicago's underground communities. The streets knew there was a dangerous predator hunting among them. Unfortunately, this knowledge didn't reach the broader community or law enforcement in time to prevent Gacy's final and most tragic victim. December 11, 1978, started like any other day for 15-year-old Robert "Rob" Piest. A sophomore at Maine West High School, Rob was known for his academic excellence, athletic ability as a member of the gymnastics team, and his dedication to scouting. Just 2 merit badges away from earning the prestigious Eagle Scout Award, he had been preparing for a community service project to clean a section of the Des Plaines River. Rob was passionate about the outdoors. He loved exploring the wilderness of the Midwest and was an avid photographer, always seeking remote locations to capture nature's beauty. With his 16th birthday approaching in just 3 months, he had been saving every dollar from his part-time job at Nissan Pharmacy, dreaming of buying a Jeep that would give him access to even more remote photographic opportunities. In 4 months of working at the pharmacy, Rob had saved $900, an impressive feat on wages of $2.85 an hour. His mother, Elizabeth, helped him manage his busy schedule, driving him from gymnastics practice to work nearly every evening and often providing dinner to eat during the car ride due to his limited time between activities. December 11th was Elizabeth Piest's 46th birthday, and the family had planned a celebration dinner followed by cake when Rob returned from work that evening. Rob arrived at Nissan Pharmacy slightly before 6 p.m., starting what would tragically be his final shift. What happened between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. that night would not only end Rob Piest's young life, but also finally bring John Wayne Gacy's decade-long killing spree to an end. The murder of Rob Peast was different from Gacy's previous crimes in several crucial ways. First, it occurred during evening hours when Gacy was completely sober. Witnesses who interacted with him shortly before and after the murder noted that he showed no signs of alcohol or drug impairment. Second, it seemed impulsive and unplanned, a stark contrast to the careful stalking and preparation that characterized his other murders. Most bizarrely, while Rob was dying, Gacy managed to take 2 business phone calls, maintaining his composure and rational demeanor as if nothing was happening. This Jekyll and Hyde transformation would later confuse even Gacy himself as he reflected on why his violent other guy personality had emerged with Rob Peast. Traditionally, Gacy's murders followed a pattern. He would consume alcohol and drugs, attack during the early morning hours, and meticulously cover his tracks afterward. Rob's murder deviated completely from this established method. It seemed spontaneous, almost accidental, and led directly to Gacy's capture in a way that felt entirely uncharacteristic of the careful predator he had become. The circumstances of how Rob encountered Gacy remain somewhat unclear, but what is certain is that by the end of that evening, another promising young life had been snuffed out by a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Rob Peast's murder was significant not just as Gacy's final crime, but as the act that finally brought him to justice. Unlike previous victims who were runaways, estranged from their families, or living on society's margins, Rob was a beloved son from a stable middle-class family. His disappearance couldn't be dismissed or ignored. His mother's immediate and persistent demands for answers would ultimately unravel Gacy's carefully constructed facade and expose the horror that had been buried beneath his house. The investigation that followed Rob's disappearance would reveal the full scope of Gacy's crimes. 33 known victims, most of them buried in his crawlspace, representing one of the worst serial killing sprees in American history. Bodies of young men like Gregory Godzik and John Butkovich would finally be identified, bringing some measure of closure to families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their sons. But for Rob Peast, there would be no escape story, no survival tale to tell. He was just a 15-year-old boy who wanted to buy a Jeep and explore the wilderness with his camera. Instead, he became the victim that finally brought a monster to justice. As we reach the end of our journey through these untold stories, a terrifying pattern emerges. From Edward Lynch's basement horror in 1967 to Rob Peast's final moments in 1978, we see the evolution of a predator who refined his methods over more than a decade. The handcuff trick, the rope and stick, the careful selection of vulnerable victims, the use of authority and employment as hunting grounds, the basement social club that served as a testing ground for terror. All of these elements combined to create one of history's most prolific serial killers. But these stories also reveal something else: the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Edward Lynch survived by playing dead. David Cram fought back with military training. Jamie used street smarts and quick thinking. Arthur Wenzel employed desperate physical resistance. Each found a way to overcome overwhelming odds and escape with their lives. Their survival stories matter not just as accounts of individual courage, but as testimony to the reality of what John Wayne Gacy was capable of. They provide context for the 33 victims who weren't so fortunate, young men like Gregory Godzik, who was buried in trenches he helped dig, John Butkovich, who died over an unpaid paycheck, and Rob Peast, who simply wanted to earn money for a Jeep. These weren't random crimes committed by a man who suddenly snapped. They were the calculated actions of a predator who spent years perfecting his craft, learning from each encounter and becoming more dangerous with every victim. The successful contractor, the children's entertainer, the politically connected businessman, these were all masks worn by a monster who understood that the best place to hide evil is behind a facade of respectability. John Wayne Gacy was finally arrested on December 21, 1978, 10 days after Rob Peast's disappearance. The excavation of his property would reveal the full horror of his crimes and bring closure to families who had spent years searching for answers. But perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is this: evil often wears a familiar face. It offers employment to young men who need work. It presents itself as authority when we're vulnerable. It hides behind clown makeup and children's charities. It builds basements stocked with games and entertainment. The survivors who shared their stories remind us that recognizing danger isn't always easy, but fighting back is always possible. Their courage in the face of unimaginable terror offers hope that even in our darkest moments, the human spirit can find a way to survive. Today, John Wayne Gacy is remembered as the Killer Clown, a monster whose name has become synonymous with the worst of human nature. But let us also remember the names of those who survived: Edward Lynch, David Cram, Jamie, and Arthur Winslow. Their stories of escape and survival are just as important as the victims we mourn. And let us never forget the young men who didn't escape: John Butkovich, Gregory Godzik, Rob Peast, and 30 others whose lives were cut short by evil masquerading as normality. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and you've been listening to Serial Killer Files, your front row seat to the darkest minds and the most disturbing serial crimes in history. If today's episode gave you chills or left you questioning what really drives a killer, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Want even more bite-sized true crime content that hits hard and fast? Check out Skoob, the AI-powered podcast app that curates short, addictive episodes made just for you. Download Skoob now from the App Store or Google Play and dig even deeper into the world of true crime.